In 1904, two financiers, a Jewish-American power broker on Wall Street and a Japanese central banker turned state strategist, made common cause with one objective: break the Russian Empire. That wasn't rhetoric. Their aim was to force a European great power into exhaustion, strip it of prestige, and rearrange the balance of power in East Asia. Within a year and a half, Russia was suing for peace. Japan had announced itself as a first-tier imperial actor, and the American banker believed he had delivered payback to a regime he considered criminal. This is not just a narrative about armies. It is a narrative about capital. It is about how bond markets, interest rates, and credibility can decide wars just as surely as artillery barrages. It is about how two men using finance as an instrument of pressure altered the trajectories of both Japan and Russia. The actual shooting began without ceremony, no warning, no formal ultimatum. On the night of February 8, 1904, Admiral Togo Heihachiro of the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered a preemptive torpedo strike on the Russian Pacific Squadron anchored at Port Arthur, the Tsar's key warm-water naval base in southern Manchuria. Several Russian battleships were hit and disabled in harbor before they could maneuver. The remainder of the fleet was pinned behind coastal guns and mines. Japan immediately locked Port Arthur under blockade and established effective control of the water around the Liaodong Peninsula. This first strike did not end the conflict on its own, but it set the operating rhythm. Japan would dictate tempo and refuse to give Russia time to stabilize. Tokyo's leadership understood that time favored St. Petersburg. Russia was enormous. The Romanov state spanned from Poland across Siberia to the Pacific coast. It had a massive population, mineral reserves, timber, coal, and the ability, at least in theory, to mobilize industrial output on a continental scale. If Russia were allowed to gather strength, ship reinforcements across its interior, and build up firepower in Manchuria, Japan's initial edge would evaporate. The only workable Japanese plan was speed and concentrated shock. By March 1904, Japan had already landed its first army on the Korean peninsula. The concept was direct: advance north through Korea, punch into Russian-controlled Manchuria, isolate Russian positions, and defeat them in sequence before they could merge into an overwhelming mass. The first clashes on land were brutal, short-range, costly. After days of hard fighting, Japanese formations forced Russian troops to give ground. That mattered symbolically as much as militarily. For the first time in the modern industrial era, an Asian state had beaten a European imperial army in open battle. Western observers, who largely assumed that European methods guaranteed superiority in training, logistics, and command, had to confront the fact that Japan could fight and win on equal technological footing. Still, neither government treated these early wins as decisive. Both sides prepared for an extended campaign that would determine who would dominate Northeast Asia. Japan consolidated its bridgeheads and secured logistics. Russia tried to move men, equipment, ammunition, horses, food, and artillery across thousands of miles toward the Far East. Geography turned into Russia's internal enemy. The Tsar's only serious supply artery into the theater was the Trans-Siberian Railway. In 1904, that line was mostly single track over immense distance. Every locomotive hauling shells or rations blocked a locomotive hauling reinforcements. A derailment, a storm, a destroyed section of track, any disruption could delay an entire army's worth of support. Every delay bought Japan breathing room, but everyone in Tokyo knew that window was temporary. If Russia ever managed to get the bulk of its strength forward, Japan would be fighting a giant. Most popular versions of the Russo-Japanese War describe siege lines, cavalry screens, infantry assaults with bayonets, and naval duels. Those images are real, but they obscure the deeper lever. The real stress point was financing. Industrial war consumes cash at a non-stop rate. Artillery shells must be cast, powder must be refined, ships must be fueled with coal, armor plate must be rolled from imported steel. Rail lines must be repaired with spare track sections. Hospitals must be equipped. Soldiers and sailors must be paid and fed. Horses must be purchased and transported. That pipeline never sleeps. A patriotic speech cannot build a cruiser. Money can. Japan needed capital just as urgently as it needed ammunition. The institution sitting at the center of that capital problem was the Bank of Japan. Though relatively young at the time, the bank had already become the core of Japan's controlled modernization program, a deliberate state-directed conversion from a feudal polity into an industrialized imperial state. On paper, it functioned as a private bank. In practice, it executed national policy. In the 1880s, the Bank of Japan secured exclusive authority over currency issuance. It imposed a unified national note, tightened monetary discipline, and built credibility. Even more importantly, Japan committed itself to the gold standard. Pegging the yen to gold did more than tidy up accounting. It sent a message to London and New York that Japan played by the rules of global finance and would honor debt obligations. That credibility would later become ammunition. Despite those reforms, by 1904, Japan's balance sheet was under extreme stress. The army was in the field, the navy was at sea. Operations were expanding, costs were exploding. Shell stocks, rifles, naval fuel, armored hull repairs, river crossings, telegraph lines, troop transport capacity, all of it demanded hard currency. Without a flow of foreign loans, Japan risked financial collapse before Russia ran out of manpower. The figure tasked with preventing that collapse was Takahashi, a senior official at the Bank of Japan and one of the sharpest financial tacticians in the country. Takahashi was not a battlefield commander. He was a strategist of funding. He spoke fluent English, had spent time in the United States, and had worked across global financial hubs, London, India, China. He had served in the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Education, and even stepped briefly into the private sector to manage a silver mining venture in Peru. That mining effort ultimately failed, but it built his network and taught him how foreign investors thought. When the war with Russia opened, he was dispatched abroad with a single assignment: secure external financing for Japan's war effort at any cost. He went first to the United States, then to Britain, which at the time sat at the center of international capital. He asked for major loans. He presented Japan as a committed, modernizing power with discipline and purpose. He was turned down again and again. Western banks still viewed Russia as the responsible borrower, and Japan as an unproven, risky upstart. From their perspective, Russia was huge, asset-rich, and embedded in European diplomatic networks. Japan, by contrast, was small, recently industrialized, and, in the eyes of many bankers, racially and politically uncertain. By the time Takahashi was preparing to head home with almost nothing to show, he encountered Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff was the senior partner of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., one of the most influential investment houses on Wall Street. Schiff's reach extended beyond New York. He could sway opinion in London and continental Europe. His involvement in the Russo-Japanese War was not just commercial. Schiff was Jewish, and he had watched the Romanov state under Nicholas II tolerate and, in some cases, enable violent anti-Jewish pogroms, including the notorious 1903 Kishinev massacres. Jewish neighborhoods were looted, families were murdered, and the authorities responded with indifference. Schiff saw the Russian autocracy as not only corrupt and backward, but actively hostile to his people. Supporting Japan offered him both a strategic move and a moral strike against the Tsar. In conversation, Takahashi did not sugarcoat Tokyo's situation. Militarily, Japan was performing well and generating real wins. Financially, Japan was nearing the edge. Without immediate access to large-scale foreign capital, the campaigns risked stalling, which would hand Russia time to regroup and counterattack. Schiff understood the leverage in that timing. He agreed to act. That decision quietly altered the trajectory of the war. Through Kuhn, Loeb & Co., Schiff arranged massive bond issuances on behalf of the Japanese government. He bought Japanese bonds himself to signal confidence. He then convinced major American banks, including First National Bank and National City Bank, to come in behind him. By late 1904, Japan had raised on the order of $200 million in foreign loans. Adjusted for modern value, that sum would correspond to multiple billions. In practical terms, it covered nearly half of Japan's total war cost. Just as significant, this was the first time Wall Street had extended financing to Japan at that scale. Schiff's reputation reassured investors. His backing essentially substituted his credibility for Japan's. Breaking through resistance Takahashi had faced alone, Schiff did not treat it as a neutral business transaction. He urged Takahashi to tell Tokyo to keep pressure on, not to negotiate early. He wanted Japan to score an undeniable strategic victory, not a polite draw. He openly hoped that a Japanese triumph would destabilize Nicholas II's regime and potentially weaken or remove it. Armed with external funding, Japan intensified operations immediately. In May 1904, Japanese forces landed a second army on the Liaodong Peninsula, the narrow landmass leading toward Port Arthur. Russian defenders had fortified high ground and choke points, but they were overmatched and gradually forced back. The Japanese seized control of rail links and ridgelines, severing Port Arthur's connection to the main Russian force in Manchuria. At the same time, fresh Japanese divisions disembarked on Korea's east coast and were organized as the Third Army, with a direct mission: take Port Arthur. Another formation advanced along the Manchurian shoreline to close any northern escape. By late May, Port Arthur was effectively surrounded. While the Japanese tightened that noose, Russia's structural problems grew more obvious. Even before shots were fired in 1904, the imperial budget was under pressure. By 1902, the claim of a balanced budget was already fiction. The tax burden on peasants was severe, urban labor was volatile, and state finances were strained. War multiplied those stresses. The Tsar's advisors saw two immediate levers: inflate the currency and risk panic, or borrow abroad on punishing terms that would publicize imperial weakness. Neither option addressed the scale of the burn rate. Cash reserves were being drained faster than they could be replaced. The siege of Port Arthur dragged through late 1904 into early 1905. Japanese heavy artillery pounded the Russian fortifications day after day. Both sides took horrific casualties in trench fighting and assaults on fortified hills. Eventually, Port Arthur capitulated. Its fall shocked the Russian elite and energized Japan, but the war itself was not over. Reinforcements from European Russia had finally made it across Siberia. The Russian High Command concentrated those troops for a counterstrike. That counterstrike unfolded around Mukden. The Battle of Mukden became one of the largest land battles in history up to that moment. Roughly 330,000 Russian troops with more than 1,500 artillery pieces faced about 270,000 Japanese soldiers with just over 1,000 guns. On paper, Russia held the numerical and artillery advantage. In the field, Japan had coordination, discipline, and a willingness to absorb extremely high losses to maintain initiative. After extended maneuver, flanking attempts, and relentless pressure, Russian lines fractured. Mukden fell under Japanese control. At sea, the pattern repeated. The Imperial Japanese Navy intercepted and destroyed most of Russia's Baltic fleet, a fleet that had sailed from European waters all the way around Africa and Asia in a last attempt to break Japanese naval dominance in the Far East. The annihilation of that fleet, remembered as the decisive destruction at Tsushima, ended Russia's realistic hope of contesting the sea. Taken together, the collapse at Mukden on land and the disaster at Tsushima at sea, Russia had suffered back-to-back defeats in both primary theaters. The psychological effect inside the empire was enormous. Inside Russia, anger detonated. Military humiliation collided with domestic grievance. Workers were already resentful over wages and hours. Peasants were already resentful over taxes and land distribution. Minority populations had long resented imperial repression. Now, all of that fed into strikes, demonstrations, mutinies in naval units, and open protests in major cities. The aura of Tsarist invincibility broke. For the first time, Nicholas II faced internal instability that could not be ignored or easily suppressed without consequences. Japan, meanwhile, had leverage. It held battlefield victories, public morale, and, because of external financing arranged through Takahashi and Schiff, the liquidity to continue fighting if necessary. Russia had losses, unrest, and a treasury in crisis. Both governments agreed to negotiate. Talks were held in the United States. President Theodore Roosevelt positioned himself as mediator. He wanted to prevent escalation, secure American influence in East Asia, and present the U.S. as a power capable of managing great power disputes. Roosevelt's role in brokering terms would later earn him the Nobel Peace Prize. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, made Japan the clear winner in practical terms. Japan gained control over the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur. a critical warm-water naval base. It acquired control of the South Manchurian Railway, which was not just infrastructure, but a strategic corridor for resource extraction, troop transport, and political leverage across southern Manchuria. It received the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Russia agreed to withdraw from southern Manchuria, an area that would later be restored to nominal Chinese sovereignty. Most importantly, Japan's dominance in Korea was formally acknowledged, which paved the way for Korea to become a Japanese protectorate and later a colony. For the wider world, the outcome was a shock. European imperial doctrine had rested on the assumption that Western militaries, supported by Western industry and Western command systems, would defeat any non-Western opponent in modern war. The Russo-Japanese War shattered that assumption. An Asian state had defeated a European empire in an industrial conflict that used modern weapons, modern logistics, and modern command structures. From that point, London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington had to treat Japan not as a regional curiosity, but as an emerging great power. Jacob Schiff's involvement became international news. Newspapers reported that a Wall Street banker had underwritten a foreign war effort and helped finance Japan's victory. Schiff was invited to Japan and personally received by the emperor, an honor rarely extended to foreigners. He became the first non-Japanese recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun. For Schiff, this was vindication on multiple levels. He had demonstrated that American capital could act independently of European diplomacy. He had also struck, indirectly but effectively, at a regime he viewed as violently anti-Semitic. Inside Russia, the political detonation continued. Military defeat fueled the revolution of 1905. Workers organized councils. Sailors mutinied aboard imperial ships. Crowds filled streets. Gunfire followed. Nicholas VI tried to survive by mixing limited reform with repression. He offered a consultative parliament and minor political concessions while simultaneously unleashing force against demonstrators and dissidents. Thousands died. The monarchy remained in place, but its authority was permanently compromised. The cracks in the Romanov order were now public and undeniable. Those cracks widened over the next decade. In 1914, Russia entered World War I. That decision threw an already unstable, cash-strained empire into an even larger industrial slaughter. Battlefield disasters, shortages of food and ammunition, and anger at the ruling elite pushed the state past the edge. In February 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty collapsed. Later that same year, in October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power, plunging Russia into civil war. The former Tsar and his family were executed soon after. During those upheavals, Schiff's name resurfaced in rumors and accusations. Many contemporaries believed, and some publicly claimed, that he had covertly supported anti-Tsarist elements and funneled money to revolutionary factions in order to undermine the Romanov regime. The narrative was simple and emotionally powerful. A Jewish American banker, angered by pogroms, using finance to help topple a monarchy that had persecuted Jews. Historians still debate the scale and channels of any direct funding, but the fact that the accusation was credible to people at the time shows how finance had come to be seen as a strategic weapon, not just a commercial tool. Takahashi Korekio's trajectory after the war was just as consequential for Japan. He became the 7th governor of the Bank of Japan, then served repeatedly as Minister of Finance. In 1921, he briefly served as Prime Minister. During the global economic crisis of the early 1930s, he pushed aggressive fiscal spending and monetary easing to pull Japan out of depression. He used deficit financing and central bank cooperation to stabilize employment and production at a time when orthodox policy in many countries was still focused on austerity. Economists later described him as Keynes before Keynes, because he implemented policies associated with Keynesian demand management before those theories were fully articulated in the West. But Takahashi's career ended violently. By the mid-1930s, expansionist factions in the Japanese army demanded ever larger military budgets and deeper penetration into mainland Asia. Takahashi warned that unchecked military spending would destroy monetary stability, drive inflation, and ultimately undermine the state's financial base. That stance put him directly in the way of radical officers who believed that the army's expansion should override civilian financial limits. In February 1936, during an attempted coup by young ultra-nationalist officers, Takahashi was assassinated in his home. His death marked the eclipse of civilian economic restraint and signaled Japan's slide into full militarism in the years leading up to total war in Asia and the Pacific. Step back, and the structure becomes obvious. Neither Takahashi Korekiyo nor Jacob Schiff ever issued an order to charge a trench or commanded a fleet at sea. Yet their decisions determined which armies could keep moving, which navies could keep sailing, and which empires could still claim credibility. Takahashi grasped that national credit is an operational weapon. He forced Japan to behave like a disciplined creditor nation even before it had the size of one. He stabilized the currency to satisfy foreign lenders, secured external loans in gold-backed terms, and then funneled that capital straight into rapid offensives designed to win before Russia's depth could be brought to bear. He effectively built a financial timetable for victory. Strike early, sustain high operational tempo with borrowed funds, and present the world with a fait accompli before attrition could reverse the balance. Schiff approached from the other end. He analyzed the Russian Empire as a stressed balance sheet disguised as a superpower. Russia was already weighed down by debt, spending heavily on rail infrastructure, bleeding cash, internally unstable, and sitting on top of angry populations it policed harshly, but relied on for revenue and labor. By channeling credit to Japan and, at the same time, making it more expensive and politically toxic for Western banks to extend favorable terms to Russia, Schiff wasn't just financing Japan. He was choking Russia. He reframed lending to the Tsar as morally compromised and strategically reckless, which in turn raised Russia's cost of capital. Higher borrowing costs translate directly into reduced freedom of action. That means less capacity to reinforce, less capacity to absorb losses, less capacity to prolong the fight. Before Russian generals lost at Mukden, Russian credit had already started losing in New York and London. Together, without coordinating battlefield tactics, Takahashi and Schiff demonstrated that command of credit can function like command of artillery. One of them built a bridge of money that let a mid-sized island nation act like an imperial power ahead of schedule. The other quietly undercut an old European empire by making it pay a premium for survival. Artillery can destroy brigades. Finance can destroy legitimacy. When legitimacy fractures, empires don't just cede territory. They begin to lose the argument that they are entitled to rule at all. The Russo-Japanese War is often summarized with a list of battles: the siege and fall of Port Arthur, the vast slaughter and breakthrough at Mukden, the annihilation of the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima. Those events matter, but they sit on top of a deeper lesson. States rise or fall because someone decides to extend or refuse credit. Japan's ascent into recognized great power status, the shockwave that forced European governments to acknowledge an Asian rival, and the cascading crises that helped bring down Nicholas II can be traced back to a working arrangement formed in 1904 between two financiers almost nobody in the general public had heard of. That arrangement did more than fund shells and coal purchases. It altered strategic geography. The capital shift helped unlock allowed Japan to lock down Korea as a protectorate, anchor itself in southern Manchuria, seize Port Arthur, and take control of the South Manchurian Railway. That railway was not just track and depots. It was leverage over resource flows, troop movements, and political pressure across Manchuria. Control of that corridor let Japan project influence deep into the Asian mainland without immediate full annexation. On the Russian side, defeat was not just a military embarrassment. It detonated domestic confidence in the Romanov monarchy. Losing to a non-European power shattered the myth that Tsarist rule was historically guaranteed and racially destined to dominate Asia. That humiliation energized the 1905 revolution, forced Nicholas II into partial reforms that weakened autocratic control, and created networks of organizers, printers, strike leaders, and mutinous soldiers who would later destabilize the regime again in 1917. The war did not actually end with the Treaty of Portsmouth. Its financial architecture kept working in the background. Japan converted wartime debt into durable imperial presence. Russia converted wartime debt into a legitimacy crisis that never healed. That pattern has not disappeared. Modern states still fight with missiles and brigades, but they also fight with access to debt markets, control over energy finance, currency credibility, sovereign bond spreads, and the ability to define an opponent as a bad risk. In 1904, that toolkit looked innovative and almost invisible. Today it is standard statecraft. So when you ask who really wins a war, you can't stop at admirals and generals. You have to include the people who decide who gets funded, on what terms, and for how long, because those signatures can topple dynasties.